Editor Technical here. I was gonna make a joke about there being no cold open, and then I realized, wait, this is the cold open.
So welcome to another episode of the podcast, and on today's episode we're joined by guests Phoenix from @FrenchTrackers, and we're joined by Kyle from @KyleGen and from @Conflicts, and host obviously by myself, Defense Geek, and Osinttechnical.
Yeah, and this week we've got the interesting situation where all five of us are members of the Military Air Tracking Association, which is an open source intelligence group set up this year in the sort of the weeks following the Kabul airlift to help sort of pool the resources and the combined knowledge of some of the larger aircraft tracking accounts on Twitter to help sort of produce more informative and more useful data for the open source intelligence community and indeed for the world's media.
Yeah, I think there was the general realization that a lot of content that was being put out over those few weeks was sort of generally scattershot and lacking sort of a general narrative. We saw, there was a lot of raw information being put out and very little actual information being communicated to people. And it was certainly a time where the members of the general public were paying a lot more attention to what we do. So there was sort of this imperative to communicate sort of the right stuff to them instead of just, throwing facts and figures and pictures of C-17s at them.
Yeah, so if I just get Phoenix, if you'd like to sort of just introduce yourself to our listeners and just explain what you and the French trackers do.
Okay, well, hi everybody, I'm Phoenix, I'm from France and I live near Toulouse. I am one of 4 administrators of at French Trackers Twitter account, and with the 3 other administrator, we do an air tracking of military of France, and in particular French aircraft. That's
Now, when
all.
it comes to sort of the more French side of course, ADSB tracking and general military tracking as a whole, what are some of the sort of unique sort of aspects of that? I know operating in the U.S., there's sort of the question of there's just so much space and a lot of room for stuff to happen. But sort of what are sort of the unique considerations when tracking inside of France?
There is we have an OpEx in Sahel region, and that's very interesting to follow on this operation. With Kabul airlift, it's very we follow the situation minute by minute, and our account is exploded at this moment. I think.
I was going to say one of the interesting things I think I've noticed about tracking in France is the unique opportunity to be able to follow the nuclear poker exercises over France.
Yeah. 2 weeks ago, I think it's happening. Yeah, it's near midnight. I don't have the time to follow all the operation, but it's very classic. But with different with our account, I received some response to little account to give me information. For example, in February 2021, I think, for the first poker exercise of the year, I received the map of closed areas on the airspace, and we can know where our fighters, where they do the low altitude penetration for exercise, and the and the Osint is in for this particular practice is very interesting because we have a lot of resources and people around France give me information. For example, in the first poker exercise, I received a report for an tanker over south of France. It's very interesting.
That actually brings up another interesting question, too. I know in the US there's a lot of government related PR and communication through the media and just through a bunch of different channels. How does the French government and especially the French Air Force sort of publicize what they do? And do they really communicate out with the French public frequently about their activities? Or is it more not secretive per se, but more quiet?
Yeah, I think the US and UK is very uh, big and we have a big echo, but France is pretty minor in social media, I think. It's pretty classic in communication. For example, there is an operation maybe 2 weeks ago, and they communicate just now. Um, um, on this summer, the airbase based in Jordan, um, we have an renewable sorry and a renewalment of two Rafale base on this airbase, and they speak just 3 weeks later about this operation, and 3 tankers are mobilized for this ferry flight, and they don't communicate a lot for that. But the account of French Air Force and the Minister of Defense do a great job for the Kabul lift. Maybe just 1 day late before sometimes, and they do a great effort for this operation in particular. But it's pretty classic in general, the communication.
Yeah, because I have noticed it is mainly through the form of just press releases, and that definitely gives you that opportunity of sort of being able to analyze what public information they put out is, which is basically just ADSB information.
I was going to
Um,
say, I don't really have I think the French have actually had the Air Force in particular is what I looked at, but it's actually in terms of their website and how they communicate through their website, is that their website is actually quite comprehensive in terms of what it looks, in terms of what it covers, as such as it's all got all the press releases on. The French they do I think it's monthly. They've got a magazine as well on their website for people to look at. In
Yeah.
particularly during Atlantic Trident, they devoted a whole a whole section and chunk of their website for them covering that. So their communication via their website is actually quite good from what I've seen.
Yeah, the new website to create new new possibilities to French Air Force, but other armies like the ground forces and the Marine Nationale, the French Navy, are pretty classic. They just post some articles on the Minister of Defense website, but just the French Air Force have an own website. But they communicate on all social media, I think, on 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 the spectrum of social media. They are on all, I think.
yeah, so more of that traditional type of communication, as you said. I think it's probably a good time now to pivot over into the main reason of what we wanted to talk about this week, which is how we do what we do. We're sort of not giving away the secret formula here, but we definitely want to sort of communicate how we're doing, how we're following flights, how we're sort of assembling together a bunch of different disparate information into a comprehensive picture. Um, because, I mean, unfortunately, a lot of this information is sort of cloudy. I think that's the best word for it. So you have to do a lot of digging, and there's a lot of different steps you have to take to sort of put together a good idea of what an exercise is, or how different flights are operating on ADSB. And I think, John, you wanted to lead into that with ADSB exchange.
Yeah, just sort of with the Kabul airlift in particular, that was sort of the big eye opener, particularly for me, as to how useful ADSB exchange is. For those of you not familiar with it, you can just Google it. It's basically a flight tracker that has a lot of built-in filters, and it uses a whole variety of different sources, obviously radar, satellite, and various other sort of less common sensor kit. And it's particularly with the Kabul airlift, which it's fair to say, wasn't a particularly public sort of event, as in it wasn't an exercise, it wasn't something that US or foreign media was publicising weeks in advance, because it was
No,
something that
it
was
was
happening.
definitely an operational activity.
Yeah.
Um, and ADSB Exchange is sort of unique in the way that it operates. It's very low overhead, basically individual streamers utilizing software-defined radios to receive ADSB communication from aircraft. The really great asset with ADSB Exchange is that they don't block anything. Um, so their coverage might not be as comprehensive, but you're able to view flight history and flight data for aircraft that other companies actually block the flight history for. So that's a really good asset, especially for military flight tracking. The big thing ADSB Exchange allowed us to do was to track B-52 history. As they were operating over Afghanistan, it allowed us basically to form a pretty good picture of aircraft as they were coming and going, and to look back in the sort of historical record and see where they were over the past few weeks, and get a good idea of sort of how much activity there was on that side of things, which is something that sites like Flight Radar 24, which is more definitely more public facing and popular than ADSB Exchange, can do, just because they block a lot of military air traffic history.
Yeah, in particular for French aircraft, without ADSB, I think we can do anything because all aircraft is blocked on flight radar 24 or others.
And also the good thing about ADSB as well is, I don't know if any of you mentioned it already, but it's literally just got like a button at the top you can click to just filter between military aircraft and all aircraft. It doesn't always catch all of them, obviously, but it is good just to get a kind of quick overview of maybe an area of the world that might be worth looking at.
Yeah. Particularly when you bear in mind that if you open ADSB Exchange with no filters, for example, at this time of the evening, there's well over 10,000 aircraft that they have the ability to track, and you could have, easily 2,000 on screen at one time. But with the filter dropped to just military aircraft, it's a lot more manageable. You've got, a couple of hundred maybe.
I was going to say another really great flight tracking feature, which I don't think gets utilized as much as I think it should, is Radar Box 24. And there's a really good little feature on there when you go into this list of receiver stations that are receiving the data from the aircraft. If you go into that, it'll bring up a list at the side with all the different flights on, and it'll catch a lot of flights either on MLAT or Mode S that aren't being picked up by either flight radar or ADSB at times. Obviously, you're not going to know the exact position on them, but it'll give you a rough area within the range where it's being picked up from.
I've
Yeah,
seen
and
on
that's a
Twitter,
huge.
wouldn't it? A lot of people have been picking up Chinese military aircraft. Is that how they've been doing it? I've seen.
Yeah, it's a massive part of it. Is often you'll get their hex codes will come up over there.
Yeah, it's usually the receivers from Taiwan are able to pick up some Chinese activity over the mainland. Um, Additionally, over Iraq, just due to the nature of how many trackers there are in the country, there's usually only one or two that are operational, but you can still get an idea of what aircraft are actually up over the country just from the general non-positional related ADSB sort of received transmissions.
Yeah, and it's fair to say that particularly for me and Evergreen Intel, when we were putting together the lists of military transport aircraft involved in the Kabul airlift, we were using ADSB, we were using flight radar, we were using radar box. There's a few other tools as well that I use. Plane Finders database is very useful for matching up airframe numbers with hex codes. I think it's probably one of the most extensive sort of databases for that sort of thing in the world.
Yeah, and I think that the general message you can draw from that is the fact that there is no one best site for doing this. There's no one best site for tracking. There's no one best site for, figuring out what's up and what's, over a certain country at any one time. You have to utilize multiple different sites to sort of get the full picture of the situation. ADSB Exchange has no blocked history, but Flight Radar has, better coverage in general, so you can utilize them in tandem sort of to find things that you wouldn't be able to find with only one site. So if you lose coverage of an aircraft, you can possibly go and find it on Flight Radar 24. And that's just something that definitely is important to take into mind, that, utilizing multiple sites significantly increases your ability to actually do the tracking.
Definitely. And I've always got the kind of different flight radars and plane radar tracking sites up. I just thought it was something quite interesting as you were talking. I was just looking at Taiwan. There's currently a U.S. Navy P-8 just circling just off the Taiwanese coast. I don't often see that. I know it's probably not that uncommon, but it
Yeah, and
caught my
that's
attention just
one of
now.
those things where, you can have just military flights up and filtered, and you can catch things as they're happening. Like, obviously, if there's a P-8 up south of Taiwan, it sort of indicates that, the US is currently deployed an asset to either watch for something, or they're attempting to observe something, most likely being done by the Chinese.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's just because of the nature of how ADSB works, and even, military aircraft are forced to use it in sort of busy areas. It's a massive asset to just flight tracking in general, and to people who want to figure out what's happening.
And it's worth saying that the fact that we have all these flight trackers, this is something that didn't exist for the general public, 15, 20 years ago, maybe even, talking 10 years ago. And it's hugely helpful for us because it gives us an insight into what's going on that we wouldn't otherwise get, because as we've already alluded to, a lot of military forces will not sort of openly discuss what flights are going on, what exercises are going on, what missions they have going on in support of different operations around the world. And ADSB and Flight Radar and all the other flight tracking applications that are out there help us to get a bigger picture of what's going on. And a lot of the time as well, we will hear one thing from sort of defence spokespeople and from the media and so on, and we'll be looking at our flight trackers and be thinking, well, hang on, we can see things are slightly different to that.
Yeah, especially when it comes to things like deployments into a region. I mean, when the Afghan airlift was occurring, we were able to fairly accurately calculate the number of aircraft going in and out of Afghanistan each day, just because pretty much every single aircraft, as it was leaving and as it was returning, had its ADS-B transceiver on. So we were able to have a really good gauge, and I know Defense Geek, you were very, very on top of this, sort of keeping a running tally of sort of how much aircraft capacity was moving back and forth in between the country. And I think we had a pretty good idea even before the US was announcing how much capacity was moving in and out, the actual capacity.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say as well that we were seeing an uptick in the number of flights sort of a good 24, 48 hours before the US sort of formally declared that an evacuation was underway. Again, had this been 10, 15, 20 years ago, without these, really useful tools that we have, we wouldn't have known what was going on until a formal statement had been released. And to a certain extent, that has kind of meant that certainly in recent times, politicians are now, to some regard, being held to account for what information they are telling the public, because with tools like this, we can now sort of look at our maps and see what's really going on, often before any formal announcements are made.
Yeah, absolutely. And at the same time, we also are seeing some level of democratization of information, which has presented some issues, of course, as we know. If we have access to, this information and we have access to detailed flight information, then potentially nefarious actors do as well. And that's certainly something to take into mind, as we move forward and as we, gather more information. It's just something to be cognizant about, not saying that what we're doing is bad or that we should stop or that, being able to communicate this information is a net negative thing. It's just something to sort of remember.
I mean, it's a tool, isn't it? Tools can be used for good or bad. It's just however people use it.
Yeah, information is powerful for many different people for many different reasons.
I think, and again, I can see why certain governments aren't happy that everyone can see what they're up to. A key example would have been, Turkey when they were moving
absolutely.
weapons.
Was about to say that.
Moving between moving weapons and soldiers to Libya, and also in the Azerbaijan Armenia war last year. Again, you could literally watch the kind of Azerbaijani cargo aircraft take off from Baku, land in Turkey, and then go back several times a day, and it's pretty obvious what's going on. But this is, and obviously, Turkey weren't very happy about it, from what I remember. And also, there was, I can't remember who it was. It's someone in the Twitter group who has beef with a certain airline. Again, I believe it's a Libyan airline. Because he called them like arms trafficking or something along those lines. But like literally just using like open source flight tracking websites and and social media.
Oh, that's Virjon, isn't it?
I was
Yes.
going to say, just
Yeah.
as you say that, he's just liked one of my tweets.
Yeah,
I couldn't
so-
remember who it was, but yeah, I remember I can't remember what the airline is, but I know they just keep sending him abuse on Twitter, which is fantastic.
Yeah, he's done some great job at sort of uncovering these white label airlines that fly under, of course, commercial cargo carrying labels, but frequently serve as proxies for a lot of different countries to transport arms, ammunition, supplies into war zones. And that's definitely one of the other important things is uncovering what certain countries want to keep covered up. A lot of countries have sought to use these airlines as a way to sort of separate themselves from their involvement in a conflict, especially countries like Turkey. So it's definitely an important thing to sort of reveal what's happening.
Yeah, and I think other sort of key examples, particularly from the last sort of 12 to 18 months, would be sort of the constant ferrying of goods between Venezuela and Iran. And I think it's fair to say we've also had cases from Russia and Syria as well. That sort of featured quite heavily as well. I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, no, definitely. And then, in the same vein of Iran, obviously you always see the regular flights from Iran to Syria. And then everyone's watching the skies, then waiting for the kind of inevitable Israeli airstrikes, 24 to 48 hours later. Um, Again, that's I mean, obviously it wouldn't make much difference to Iran or the goods they're transporting, but it's still incredible to me that they do it so brazenly and that everyone can just watch these arms shipments or whatever they are come in so regularly. Obviously they do it with in full view of everyone, which is fantastic for us. But
Yeah, and if I can just sort of get you three's opinions, I think certainly for me it kind of changed the way that um, the media now looks at conflicts as well, because with all this extra information that we can now get ahead, as I said, of sort of political announcements, what sort of impact do you think like open source flight tracking, for example, has had on the way that media portray different situations we've seen?
Well, I was going to say, like, particularly from a media point of view, is that it can be used as partly as more evidence to essentially say, well, the X country's government has said and claimed this, but open source data shows the opposite occurring.
yeah, you
Essentially,
said exactly what I was going to say. I think it's the media that are less likely to maybe take a government's word at face value when there's so much, immediate evidence to the contrary.
it essentially just makes it provides room for governments around the world to be essentially called out by the media when they've attempted to lie or change not necessarily change the facts, but essentially hide them as such.
Yeah, no, exactly. An example I'm thinking of, where government claimed one thing and then obviously proven the other one was when Iran shot down that Ukrainian airliner. Obviously, that was a civilian aircraft. It was on all the flight tracking websites. Um, and it wasn't so much like the flight tracking websites that showed anything different had happened, but it was a combination of a combination of that, and then obviously the photo and video evidence which came out again on social media, which kind of got them to change the narrative. But I can remember when it happened. I remember like the first thing I remember checking was like the flight tracking websites, and I can remember you could go back and you could watch that flight take off, turn, kind of start, kind of start increasing in altitude, and then just kind of blinking out of existence on the screen. And it's quite weird to watch when you know exactly what happened to that aircraft.
Yeah.
Um, I can remember everyone was um looking at the on flight radar 24. Obviously you've got the kind of altitude data and kind of speed data and everything, and everyone's kind of looking at that to try and see if there was anything that kind of suggested it was like a technical issue or human error or something like that. I mean, that's I'm not very great at interpreting that kind of thing. um but that's the first kind of example that's popped into my mind about a government claiming one thing and then having to retract it and admit to something else.
Yeah, and it's fair to say that, like you say, that data was incredibly useful because that sort of gave the world a glimpse of what had actually happened well
Mhm.
before the black boxes were recovered and well before any sort of formal investigation into the crash had gotten underway.
Oh yeah, definitely. And you could definitely make the argument that they changed and admitted to what happened almost so entirely based on um like open source, kind of like researchers who were digging into it and finding these images and finding these videos and
Hmm.
piecing together the what happened. Because I can remember there was photos of missile debris, and eventually there was eventually the video that came out which showed a missile hitting the aircraft, which was the kind of nail in the coffin, so to speak, for the Iranian government.
Yeah.
um but you go back 20 years, or even not even that long, 15 years ago, that footage wouldn't have existed. um
Hmm.
and we might never have known exactly what happened. People would have claimed various things, but the truth might never have come out over something like that, which is what makes the open source kind of element of things these days particularly interesting.
Yeah, because particularly with countries like Iran and North Korea and Venezuela, which it's fair to say are fairly secretive in their approach to sort of the outside world, open source information, particularly flight tracking and that sort of thing, has kind of split their insides open, if you like. It's made things very difficult for them when they want to try and hide what's going on. And not just sort of militarily. We're also talking about, for example, all the protests that have been going on in Iran for well over a year and a half now.
Yep.
As much as I hate this particular platform, TikTok, I think it's fair to say it's become a major source for information for us, hasn't it?
Absolutely, yeah, it definitely has. It's I think it's the bane of militaries around the world or authoritarian governments around the world. TikTok at the moment, because
Except China, anyway.
except China. Well, I consider it as a Chinese app. It's it's pretty impressive, but
It's
It's
like the snap map
yeah,
during the cable lift. It's very useful too.
yeah, yeah. Snapchats, Snap Maps, and just Instagram as well. Just becoming really, really useful, and that's kind of the beauty of open source intelligence. It's all from places and from apps and stuff that pretty much anyone can access.
yeah,
And it's the sort of the beauty of it all is that we take the information, all of that information, and we use it to tell the story in a way that sort of most people just wouldn't be able to do. They just wouldn't have the time to do, or they wouldn't know how to.
no, exactly. Um, and one of the main things I use, the kind of flight tracking thing, and it's one of the things that I'm always surprised appear on a flight tracking thing. It's just the sheer volume of Turkish drones that appear up, even when they're kind of operational and over kind of like active war zones like Syria and Iraq. They always appear on flight radar. I mean, I've looked right now. There's two pretty much on the Iraqi border, just kind of circling various towns or villages. You look at Syria sometimes, and there's 6, 7 drones all over kind of northern Syria, and I always find that quite interesting. Because you can always tell, when they found something or when or when they've found someone they're looking for, because they'll just be circling the same village for hours and hours and hours. There's all a lot concerning a lot of militaries when they kind of like active operations. They'll never appear on flight tracking websites, with that notorious exception of when India forgot to switch the transponders off when they were bombing Pakistan a few years back. I don't know if you remember that. People were just watching them kind of cross the border, circle for a bit, and come back. I think a few people who were tweeting about it got their accounts suspended. I don't know if any of you guys remember that. But that was definitely an interesting couple of weeks.
Yeah, and I think to a certain extent as well, what we're seeing from some countries now is that they're almost using the fact that there are open source intelligence sort of trackers out there watching aircraft movements, almost to try and sort of help form their narrative of things. I think an example of that we probably see most commonly would be in the Korean Peninsula, where we see on a regular basis US sort of intelligence gathering aircraft doing their little orbits, watching North Korea closely. And the fact that we're able to see that and the fact that we report on it is almost a way for the US effectively to sort of just remind North Korea that they're there and that they are watching still, even if North Korea is perhaps not as much of a focus in the news as it has been, say, a couple of years ago.
No, definitely. Yeah, because I can remember when there was the rumor that North Korea were going to conduct another nuclear test. You could watch the kind of, I can't remember exactly which aircraft they were, but the kind of the the nuke sniffers, I believe, is kind of the informal term for them, just kind of going up and down the border and along the coast and stuff like that. So I remember there's a few late nights when people would see those go up and be like, "Oh, maybe tonight's the night." But I don't think it ever kind of happened. But it's going back to like what you said, it's kind of like not a warning as such, but it's kind of almost preventative, isn't it? Like North Korea might say, "Oh, well, if the aircrafts are up tonight, maybe we won't do it on this particular occasion, or something else." But yeah, no, definitely, because if one of those aircraft are up, even if the media don't pick it up, one of us do normally. So someone who's got nothing better to do than watch these websites all day, of course, they'll get tweeted about, and maybe they'll get to pick up a bit of traction. Um, so it definitely gets noticed for sure. Yeah, so North Korea acting up again, which is I think they were getting a bit jealous that they weren't in the news as much, really. But it's been 4 missile tests over the last month, which, as far as I could tell, is some of the most kind of, lost the word for it, not compact, compressed, something along those lines.
Condensed.
Condensed kind of missile testing they've done, as far as I can tell. Because it's been more or less one a week, isn't it? Which I can't remember them kind of doing anything along those lines. Even at the kind of height of the kind of tensions with the US, it was obviously a lot of tests, but they definitely weren't one a week. And what's kind of interesting to me as well is the kind of variety of missiles. So I think I think the most recent one was an anti-aircraft missile, right?
Yeah, it was.
And then before that, it was the hypersonic glide vehicle.
Yeah, which is, as I tweeted at the time, it's an interesting development because North Korea's gone from sort of everyone just thinking, yeah, they're just trying to develop ballistic missiles that they can fit a warhead on, and suddenly now they've got anti-aircraft missiles and this, as you say, hypersonic glide vehicle, which is a technology that sort of even the US, Russia, and China haven't sort of officially perfected yet.
No. And speaking of China, there was another missile test recently which looked almost identical to a Chinese kind of equivalent. So I mean, I don't know if China is kind of stepping up like kind of assistance of North Korea's missile tech, or if they've always been at this kind of or they've kind of kept the same level, and now North Korea has finally cracked a few things. But it seems they've definitely not as much of a, I don't want to say a joke as such, but a lot of people did kind of see North Korea as a joke, especially like the missile tests as kind of nothing to be concerned about, because they were kind of seen as using kind of Cold War era tech and just kind of nothing that could really do significant amount of damage. But like I said, now they're kind of branching into these hypersonic, glide vehicle and kind of almost modern looking anti-aircraft systems. It's definitely not a worry as such, because I can't see anything really happening on the Korean Peninsula. Not definitely. Well, maybe a few years ago it was more of a chance, but I can't see it now. But it's definitely interesting to see how North Korea have kind of modernized their military over the last decade or so.
Yeah, and it's worth adding as well that South Korea has gone from a few years ago under a different president where they were sort of very, very concerned about North Korea and its missile developments and so on, to where they are now, where they seem somewhat, unbothered by what's going on in the north, and at the same time they're developing their own weapons and supposedly also trying for an active peace plan with North Korea. And it's such a weird dynamic. I know their relations have sort of broken down somewhat, South Korea's with Japan, kind of as a result of all of this. And we are, of course, we can't sort of mention North Korea's missile test without also mentioning South Korea having a submarine launch ballistic missile test not too long ago.
Yeah, I think it's just an response of a soft um, test. of her own sub launched missiles.
Yeah, it
And
definitely is.
yeah,
So you didn't often, even when North Korea was at their most kind of antagonist, or kind of when they were doing a lot of I can't even remember what the exact words they traded with Trump were, but when there was a lot of threats kind of going back and forth, it didn't seem South Korea were even that bothered at the time then, because North Korea's focus was almost entirely on the US. They weren't really threatening South Korea as much. And you don't often hear about South Korean missile tests, so especially a submarine launched ballistic missile, which is, I mean, not again in terms of countries which have done that, it's again quite a small club, I believe. So yeah, it's definitely interesting. Obviously, like I say, the tensions with Japan aren't great. Not again, I believe anything's going to come of that. I not especially not with a kind of shared threat of China on the doorstep.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think a lot of people are always surprised when they see that like South Korea and Japan they don't really have a great relationship. It's almost quite confrontational a lot of the time. I suppose it makes sense when you kind of if you look back at the kind of historical of the region, but um, yeah, that kind of region of Asia isn't as unified as perhaps a lot of people might think they are.
And it's worth saying as well that obviously with if North and South Korea are indeed engaging actively in sort of diplomatic efforts, it kind of throws an interesting power dynamic at Japan, who in recent times in particular, I think it's fair to say, have been sort of looking to Australia and the UK alongside the US as sort of their main allies in that region.
Mhm.
Albeit obviously the US and the UK not so much being physically present in the region as sort of diplomatically present.
Yeah, there's a lot of because the like Japan, the military, they're trying to. But I mean, officially they only had a defense force, right? And I think they're
It,
currently in the process of
it's
kind
still
of change.
branded all as it's still branded as defense force as such because you got the JSDF, Japanese Air Self Defense Force, GMSDF, Japanese Maritime Self Defense Force. It's still
Mhm.
branded as that, but it's still branded as self defense force. But I mean, granted, they cannot do much with that because of their constitution, but it's essentially one of the world's best equipped militaries.
Yeah, yeah, but and it seems they are very slowly kind of trying to um convert themselves into more of a traditional military, I suppose.
And South Korea is sort of very similarly equipped to Japan. I think it's fair to say they've got a lot of the same sort of US based tech, and
Mhm.
particularly navy wise, they use a lot of the same sort of warship designs and sort of weapons systems as the Americans and the Japanese. And
yeah, like
Yeah.
the Aegis
yeah, yeah, like
combat.
the Aegis system, and that kind of it makes for an interesting power dynamic because it's you've got Japan and South Korea who aren't necessarily on the best of terms, but are armed and allied with the same US, sort of military forces, and they both countries have a fairly substantial US military presence in them as well. I think it's fair to say. Um,
Mhm.
I think if North Korea were to attack one, potentially the other might not get involved were it not for the US presence, perhaps, or the sort of the wider threat. And I think it's fair to say these latest North Korean missile tests have sort of very much brought that threat into sharp focus. The ballistic missile tests that we saw the other week, the range that was talked about, I think it was 1,500 kilometers or something like that, puts the whole of South Korea and pretty much the whole of Japan within range of these weapons. And it's fair to say that North Korea is probably only really looking at those two countries in the region. Obviously, because they have US presence on them, but also because North Korea is fairly well allied with China. They don't really have much of an issue with Russia.
And on the same topic of missiles as well, there was that story a few weeks back, wasn't there, that Japan are going to place some missiles just off the Taiwanese coast, which China is very unhappy about. Because when you look at a map of Japan, you don't. It's really incredible how far south these islands actually go. I mean, there's a tiny island literally just about 200 kilometers east of Japan, of Taiwan. Sorry. When you think Taiwan is a good 1,000 kilometers from the Japanese mainland, it's very close, and obviously very close to China as well. Who again been acting up in recent days, especially again around Taiwan.
Yeah, I don't know if you want to just sort of, as we're sort of leading into that conversation, I don't know if you want to just sort of explain that a little bit further.
Yeah, so it was over the last 2 days. They've hit. I can't remember what it was yesterday. Was it 38 aircraft?
It was 38 yesterday in 2 separate incidents, and 39 today in 2 separate incidents.
Yeah. Oh, so yeah, so 38 and 39 Chinese aircraft which went into Taiwan's air defense identification zone, which isn't the same as breaching Taiwan's
And not their
airspace.
space.
No. But yeah, so they've been kind of regularly doing this pretty much every day for, I mean, I don't know, months, years.
It's at least been going on for this past year or so, because it's only recently that the Taiwanese Ministry of Defense started reporting the air incursions quite literally as they happen.
Yeah. Again, yeah, you would kind of check on, like, you would look on Taiwan's Ministry of Defense like Twitter account, and they'd be like, oh, today 4 aircraft breached. Yesterday there was 2. There was 10 the day before. And I believe until yesterday the record was 28 in a single day. So yesterday's record of 38 and today 39. It's a big step up. And it was almost entirely kind of fighter aircraft. So I'm just checking today. So total today they were I'm trying to do basic maths here. 26 J16s and 10 Su-30s, which breached.
I think in total in the last 48 hours, someone was saying there's been a total of 80 aircraft that have made incursions.
Yeah, it's just crazy. And a lot of people kind of try to downplay it by saying that Taiwan's air defense identification zone kind of extends over mainland China, which it does. But they don't report the aircraft which are over mainland China. If you ever look at the maps, the aircraft are always southwest of Taiwan, literally just inside the zone. So the Chinese aircraft, they know exactly what they do, and they know how far they can push it without really triggering a kind of a significant response. And just looking at the maps from today, the Su-30s kind of they kind of, so they came from China's mainland, kind of go west of Taiwan, and then they turn around and go back to I'm assuming the base they came from. So it's not like it's just standard movement, something you'd expect. It's always it's quite obviously a provocative move, and they've been doing it, like I said, daily almost, and well, probably more than for the last year, but like you said, it's only been reported for the last year. And obviously it's coming the back of more stronger rhetoric from Chinese officials and media personalities who semi-regularly threaten to invade Taiwan and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
So I don't think it necessarily believes that like an invasion is imminent or even close. It's definitely a significant show of force.
Yeah.
Kind of like I said, to even get 40 aircraft over the course of a day to just to just piss off your neighbors is spectacularly petty. Yeah, but it's definitely something interesting that's been happening over the last 48 hours, and it'll be interesting to see if what the count is tomorrow. If they report it tomorrow, I don't know if they report it on Sundays. I know the Ukrainian OSCE monitors never report stuff over the weekend or on Sundays, which I always find really annoying when I'm trying to find out what's going on. So yeah, we'll see. We'll see if the kind of count is in, if it's still in the 30s, then it might necessitate watching a little bit closer. And like we talked about earlier, maybe seeing if we can pick up a few of the hex codes on tracking websites.
Yeah. I think it's worth also just adding as well that as much as there are people out there who are adamant that China is gearing up to invade Taiwan, particularly from sort of the naval side of things, they are not quite in a position where they're ready for that kind of an invasion. If they were to launch an airborne invasion tomorrow, I wouldn't be entirely surprised. They certainly have the military transport capacity for something like that. But again, the likelihood of them attempting something like that is, as Kyle said, fairly low. Particularly given that, as we say, Taiwan is very keenly making the world aware of the flights that are entering the air defence identification zone. And also, I think it's worth saying that any sort of mass of military transport aircraft moving from China out towards Taiwan would probably end up all over the likes of Snap Maps and Instagram and TikTok and so on. So any sort of attempt would very, very quickly lose the element of surprise.
I mean, yeah, it definitely will very quickly be all over social media. But I mean, like Taiwan is the shortest distance. It's only about 185 kilometers from the Chinese mainland. So it's, I feel like they could get a significant amount of aircraft up and over before it hits social media in a significant way. But again, like the short distance is again interested in terms of a potential invasion in that 185 200 kilometers, it's well within the range for kind of conventional missiles. So they might not, obviously, like aircraft to kind of strike kind of strategic areas in Taiwan would be necessary. They could they could do a significant amount of damage to the country without a single aircraft even leaving an airbase in mainland China, which is the real danger. Yeah,
They
I
do.
remember. Oh,
Sorry.
sorry. Oh, go on.
Just I want to say, they do. Taiwan Air Force do training on highways of Iceland. Yeah.
Do they do training on highways? Did you say?
Yeah.
Like kind of landed on highways?
Yeah.
Yeah, if air bases are attacked,
Oh, I know.
they can
Yes.
do
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just
like
looking
Sweden.
at Taiwan's Air Force now. I have no idea like what kind of what kind of equipment they have, what kind of what kind of quantities. I'm just going to the kind of standard Wikipedia. I mean, yeah, it says here they've got 116 F-16s and 40 on Mirages and 100 and so kind of elsewhere. So they definitely don't have like a. They definitely got a more significant air force than some countries a lot bigger than Taiwan, which is, I mean, unsurprising really when you see who their neighbors are. But I suppose you can have all the aircraft in the world if if your airfields are rubble, there's not much you can do about it. But yeah, it'll definitely be an interesting one to watch, especially like I said, there was that P8 kind of hanging around Taiwan. So I mean, as much as we're all watching that region, the US are obviously watching it quite closely as well. What they'll do about it if China does decide to act is, I suppose, maybe a debate for another time. But it's definitely going to be interesting. That P8's disappeared as well. I just wanted to have a look to see if it's still there. It's no longer on flight radar.
Right, okay, I think we will start to round it up there. Has anyone got sort of any major news stories from open source intelligence world, or?
And there's the rumours from tonight from Afghanistan, isn't it, that the lights in Bagram are back on? And what that could mean. I mean, there's obviously the rumours that China have moved in, but there's no evidence of that at the moment.
Yeah, I quite like the explanation I saw earlier that the Taliban have just finally found the light switch.
And I did see that. That made me laugh.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
that
think,
did tickle me.
like you say, for the time being, it's probably important not to read too much into the lights turning back on at Bagram. I think it's fairly safe to say the lights haven't turned back on because the Americans have returned. That's definitely not happened. But whether
I did see a couple of people say, yeah. No, I seen a couple of people say there was some military aircraft that landed today at the airbase. Again, there's no photos or videos to say one way or the other. But I guess I did have a look on Sentinel earlier to see if there was any recent satellite imagery. But it's just 28th of September was the last one I have. But that, if it is the case and someone is moving in to Bagram, whether it's China or I know Turkey was talking about it at some point, wasn't it? Or was that just Kabul airport? They were thinking about kind of moving into there.
Yeah.
No, but they've definitely turned the lights on for a reason, haven't they? I believe, not just making sure the power's still on.
And before we finish, I'm just going to sort of give a quick roundup of some of the stories from the last 2 weeks. As we already mentioned, in the last sort of 48 hours, China has sent somewhere in the region of 80 military aircraft into Taiwan's air defense identification zone. As we sort of discussed, it's something that has been going on for a while, but there's definitely been a significant uptick in the last few days of this. The Israeli Defense Forces intelligence chief has revealed that a US decision to conduct the airstrike that killed Iran's General Soleimani back in 2020, and I think it's fair to say we all remember that night very, very well, came as a result of Israeli intelligence that showed that General Soleimani was weeks away from beginning a campaign of attacks against US forces across the Middle East. That article is quite an interesting read. I think Technical will probably drop the link to it in the description on YouTube if you want to go and check that out. The UK's Red Arrows have arrived in RAF Akrotiri yesterday, en route to the United Arab Emirates.
They're already in the UAE.
Oh, okay, they're already in the UAE. shows how quickly out of date info gets.
I think there was a photo of them next to an Emirates airline. I think I saw something like that on Twitter.
Okay. And the US CIA has revealed that during the Kabul airlift, CIA special operatives conducted their own rescue mission of persons in the country and directly enabled the rescue of 2,000 US citizens, 4,000 local staff who had supported the US, and in particular the US Embassy, and over 1,500 foreign journalists and non-governmental organisation employees. Considering the airlift itself, we saw 100,000 plus evacuated. That's quite a significant chunk at the hands of the CIA. I think it's fair to say.
No, that's definitely incredibly impressive. I guess the downside is that it was necessary in the first place, but no, it's definitely an impressive operation. So I think that all the crews and everyone that was involved in that can be proud of themselves. Politicians, not so much.
Yeah, exactly. And that pretty much rounds up the sort of news, the sort of major news stories for the last 2 weeks. Thanks again to Kyle and also to Phoenix for joining us for this episode. It's been a pleasure to have you both on.
Thank you very much.
You'll be
Yep.
able to find the links to their Twitter accounts in the description of the podcast episode for this week. By all means, go and give them a follow. They're a great pair of guys and very, very good at what they do. On the topic of the podcast, we have expanded a little bit further, as some of you will have seen on Twitter today. So along with the sort of usual Spotify, Apple, Amazon Music, Audible and Google Podcasts, and obviously our YouTube video, we are now also available on Deezer, for those of you who use that. We are shortly to be available on Stitcher, which is another podcast streaming site. And if you own an Amazon Echo or the Google Home devices, you can now listen to us on TuneIn as well. If you'd like to support the podcast in some way, we also know, so link for that will also be in the description. And with that said, thank you very much for listening, and until next time.